Good evening and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Clarence Williams, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon's session. Force, police reform, a three-leg stool. Police reform continues to be a very necessary conversation as we experience the numerous egregious acts of unwarranted force upon Black and Brown people in this country. We will have a discussion about the force which impacts the use of force. The CLE will explore laws, accountability, training as it relates to use of force, and orders and steps to trace the deformities and highlight the opportunities for effective reform. Law enforcement reform takes a comprehensive approach. Our three-legged stool discussion is going to demonstrate and highlight those areas that need to be addressed if we're going to have comprehensive and true law enforcement reform in the United States of America. We have with us quite an assembly of professionals in the industry, in the legal profession, and those who have unique and dynamic experiences bridging the gap between community and policing. Let me begin by introducing myself again, Clarence Williams. I am a retired lawyer, retired police chief. I have over 40 years of experience in the business. I have the honor of co-chairing the Police Reform and Brutality Committee for the National Bar Association, along with my fellow co-chair, Attorney Daryl Parks. Let me begin the introduction of our panelists. It's an honor, it's a privilege for me to introduce Chief Michael Cureton. Chief Cureton has over 30 years of experience. He began his career with the Cincinnati Police Department, where he ascended to the rank of Assistant Police Chief, becoming only the second person of color to hold that office in the over 150-year history of the Cincinnati Police Department. From there, Chief Cureton went on to serve as the police chief for the University of Cincinnati Police Department, where he oversaw transformational activity and innovative collaborative agreements between the university and the surrounding communities. Chief Cureton, it is said, there's not a single piece of law enforcement reform in the city of Cincinnati that doesn't have his fingerprints on it. He's led the charge for 2 consent decrees, one federal, one state, and he is currently involved in the collaborative effort between the United States of America and the Cincinnati Police Department and the university community. Our next panelist I'd like to introduce is retired police captain Rick Morrison. Rick began his career in 1989. He has served over 30 years in the industry, the last 22 years with the Roanoke Police Department. Rick has served as the Police Training Academy Director. As director, Rick supervised the department's accreditation process and became one of the first independent police academies in the country to become nationally accredited. Since his retirement, Rick started Inspired Policing Solutions, LLC, a consulting and training company geared toward impacting organizational transformation and community cultural change in the industry. Our next panelist is Captain Dennis Mohammed. Many in the law enforcement and public safety regard Captain Dennis Mohammed as a leading authority and much sought after speaker on bridging the gap between community and law enforcement in the area of cultural diversity and racial profiling training. Captain Mohammed has over 30 years of experience as a law enforcement consultant, private safety and executive protection. His career, including training over 15 police departments in cultural diversity, emotional survival. He has trained 25 schools under the Safe School Healthy Initiative, which includes over 2,000 students. He is the founder of At One Enota initiative. Captain Mohammed has been training both law enforcement and community to help reduce crime and gun violence in cities throughout the United States and the United Kingdom. He is the founder of Peacekeepers Global Initiative, which teaches citizens to communicate and reduce gun violence and crime in their neighborhoods along with law enforcement. Captain Mohammed, although not a law enforcement professional, he served as the Supreme Captain for the Nation of Islam, responsible for security concerns and executive protection during his service in the nation. A side note, the captain was responsible for designing and implementing the safety concerns around the Million Man March that we all know was a successful event where 1 million black men gathered, 1 million plus black men gathered in Washington, D.C. without one incident. And certainly, ladies and gentlemen, last but not least, I'd like to introduce Attorney Daryl Parks. He is an accomplished lawyer and businessman. He is the managing partner of Parks Law, LLC. Through his dedication to civil rights activism and his commitment to community, Attorney Parks has represented families such as Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Corey Jones. The national reputation gained by Attorney Parks has landed him with appearances on numerous national television broadcasts, including ABC, MSNBC, CNN, and yes, Fox News. He is also the co-chair of the National Bar Association's Committee on Police Brutality and Reform, and I'm happy to serve with him. In addition to that, he is a past national president of the National Bar Association. Ladies and gentlemen, a virtual round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so very much. Gentlemen, I want to get right into it in our discussions. You know, I am of the opinion, I'm convinced that our looks at police reform, including the major initiatives that are currently out there and before the public, one being the 21st Century in Policing that was introduced under President Barack Obama's administration, the other being currently the George Floyd Integrity in Policing Act that is currently working its way through the legislatures. All of those approaches are aimed at reforming police, and we certainly want to talk about them. But before we get into those, I want to begin with, and I'll ask this question, and it's to each of the panelists, and whomever's the bravest, jump in there first. To begin, I want to ask, let's take a few minutes and tell us, from your perspective, why policing in America is in need of an overhaul. Captain Morrison, will you start off, Rick?
I would love to. I think I'm going to keep it very simple, is we as a society, as a community, we have lost trust in law enforcement. And when we lose trust in something, it's very difficult to get that back. And just treat police and policing as a relationship between customers or community and police. And what happens when trust is broken by either side or both, reform or meaningful reform is hard to come by. So I think why this is so important, especially for this event today, is to really highlight, and we have to be honest with ourselves, especially from the police perspective, if we have lost trust from our customers.
Thank you so very much. Attorney Parks, from a lawyer's perspective, why is it necessary in America to overhaul? Why does law enforcement need overhauling?
Well, I think
you agree.
I agree wholeheartedly. And it's sort of like when a call comes into our office and a person has had an encounter with an officer. And so often, I live in the Southeast, so often that encounter can come in many different ways. It can be a sheriff's department, it can be a local police department, or it could be in a place like where I'm from, Polk County, Florida, where the landscape is different. And so one of the things that I've experienced is that most of the time, law enforcement is going to operate at the level that they believe that their community will tolerate. And it's one of the wisest things I've learned over the years and being in different places, operating. Law enforcement knows what their community will tolerate. Now, sometimes that's, that gets off kilter a little bit, but I think without question, I think the problem is a very complicated question, Clarence, and I'll answer it in this way. And I know I'm on a panel a lot of law enforcement people. I think as a society, America made a decision a long time ago that they were perfectly okay with giving law enforcement whatever they need to do to make the majority feel safe, whatever that is. That means giving y'all, most of the budget and saying, "Hey, do it." That's the society we live in. And people don't talk about it like that, but I get to see it because the work I do, and I think about the level of resources that people put toward protection as a community, governments. So that's my take on it.
Thank you so very much. Chief Cureton.
Yes, yes, it needs overhauling because so much has changed. The politics have changed. When I started, a police chief was pretty much in a position for life. And now the politics is that the mayor can select the police chief or council can select the police chief. So the politics, who's in charge of the police department has changed. The economics have changed. When I was a young police officer, $15 an hour was an awful lot of money. And I was happy as a lark to be a young police officer. Now police officers are making $100,000, $150,000 a year. It's serious money being employed as a police officer. So the economics have changed in terms of how much it costs to have a police force. The social structure of our society has changed. Socially, we've got sort of this melting pot has really melted. And so it's not just, Black folks or just white folks. There's all kinds of other folks that need protection from policing. And then the big change is technology. We got these little bitty cameras that have more power than the NASA computers that put a man on the moon. It's now in our pocket. And so technology has changed such that, it's self-evident what technology has done. So just those few things alone requires a police force that's much different than 20, 30 years ago when they just hired the biggest person with the heaviest voice and the nicest jab. That's my take on why they got to change.
Captain Muhammad, why policing in America needs an overhaul? Captain, you're on mute.
How are we doing now?
You're fine.
Good. Well, Chief, it's very clear we would not be here talking about police reform if it have not been over at least the last year, the 6 months national attention to the national shootings by law enforcement with people of color. It seems like every week, Chief, there is a police officer somewhere that had crossed that line. And because of him crossing that line, some brown or black person was killed, maimed, or hurt. And this have got us national attention. So we wouldn't even be here talking about this if it had not got this national. Now, why does it need to be reformed? Looking at it from the African-American side of the fence, Black people are tired that every time we have to send our children out, we have to give them a different kind of speech that other people don't have to give their children. We have to teach our children that when you're stopped by law enforcement, this is a certain way you should act. That should not be the case, Chief. And it should not be the case that as we hear constantly from law enforcement, they want to go home. All of the training of law enforcement, I believe, is to teach them street survival skills, how to go home as a police officer, not taking into consideration that the person that they stop, they want to go home too. So we're looking at a gross abuse by some, not all, by some, who have crossed that line of their authority and have taken the life, an innocent life. They became the judge, jury, and executor all in one, and never gave that human being, that citizen, the right of due process. So does it need reform? Yes, it does. I'm anxious to get into the meat of this subject, but Obama tried to approach it once before, Chief. When he had that situation with our professor, he called it a teaching moment. It has been a dialogue that America have dodged. They have dodged this dialogue. Well, I'm happy we're dealing with it and we're peeling back the onion. We're going to deal with our hope, Chief, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Thank you so very much, Captain Muhammad. And thank each of you for your responses. And we're going to try to get as much as we can in. We want to try to save some time at the end for some questions, and I'm sure there are going to be some. And so let's get into some meat. You asked for this, Captain Muhammad, and we're gonna do it. We're gonna start off with Attorney Parks. Look, we see people, we see law enforcement. We're capturing them on cameras now, and we're seeing violent acts. We're seeing citizens shot down, and we're seeing responses. That looks like murder to me. Then we see prosecutors who will not bring charges on those same things that we're seeing that looks like murder to us. Then we see attorneys that are trying to bring lawsuits and getting results that are different than what our own eyes are seeing from these videos. Tennessee v. Garner, 1985, and Graham v. Connor, 1989, US Supreme Court case, are the cornerstones and the foundations for the police use of force standard in America, as I read them. Are you able to share with the listening audience the impact, the outcome, and the specific standard created by those cases and how they apply to outcomes that we see in use of force cases?
Thank you, Chief. I think the Tennessee v. Garner case from 1985 starts off in setting the standard that the reasonableness of the officer's use of force from the officer's perspective was the standard there. 4 years later, the court came about and said, well, let's call it the objectionable reasonable police officer in light of circumstances confronting them. But what those two cases did in totality is, one, it increased the possibility that the court could look at the totality of the circumstances that the officer was facing. Number two, it dealt with the issue that the legal issue really being presented was the use of deadly force intruding upon the Fourth Amendment rights of the person and their right not to be unlawfully searched and seized. And next, the law from these two cases certainly established the use of force must be reasonable. And lastly, it created the standard that the nature of the intrusion must be weighed against the government's interest. Now, the impact of all of this is kind of like the experience that my former partner Ben Cropper and I had when we were in court on one of our very first, more high-profile cases against the sheriff's department in Florida. And we were in front of a judge at a case management conference, and we weren't talking about a motion. We were just having court talk, but we were in the middle of open court. And this judge decided he wanted to talk about a case in the middle of open court. Well, we were a little scared to death because we weren't really ready to talk about the law and the case and to get into it in that regard. But it was a real learning experience for us in that the judge in that case felt so impacted by the law and handcuffed by the law of qualified immunity that he felt he had almost no way to rein into what the officers did, why they did it, and the circumstances that they did it. And so even in a court that might be inclined to rule in your favor, the law is against you. And that's a tough impact because you quickly realize as a lawyer practicing that your whole case, even if it's good facts, is going to be all uphill. Well, that type of uphill battle for a lawyer doing civil rights leads to a lot of bad outcomes. And it's the real reason that you really don't see a lot of very successful civil rights cases that are litigated. Reason being, at least in my state of Florida, in almost most situations, you can go into a case very well intentioned. You can sue the officer, sue the department, sue the city, sue the county. You could come in and in Florida, we could do what's called pleading in the alternative. And you could plead various counts and have, your state counts, your violation of civil rights counts, split them up to some degree and do it. Well, you'll go in, you'll do some discovery, you'll get in a motion hearing, and you'll find out, you'll come out just wearing your underwear, meaning most of your civil rights claims have been stricken or dismissed. So much so I once told one of my judge friends that, I've almost come to the professional opinion that a lawyer in my state is better off just pleading a single negligence count. That way you don't have to worry about no motions and you can go slap with a big verdict and leave all that motion practice behind. And so that's the outcome. So the outcome is that very few people really are able to litigate successfully civil rights claims. The big exception being if you have some policy and practice stuff that exists that you can do, if you have some great excessive use of force stuff that you can do, then you may have other legs to stand on. I can tell you in one case I'm involved in right now, we flirted with the notion of whether or not we could put forth the decedent's right to bear arms and maintain that constitutional claim as one of the violations of his constitutional law. There's a case law out there against that. Just FYI, we just recently did that research. So I think at the end of the day, though, the cases stand for the specific standard that the objection of reasonable police officer standard in light of the circumstances that officer is facing is the battle that lawyers are up against. And that's a tough situation because almost all of the situations that officers are in where somebody's life is lost, it's arguable that he could have been doing what he was claiming to do.
So let's look at that standard from the law enforcement end and hold your thought there. So Chief Cureton and Captain Morrison, tell us about the reasonable police officer. Apparently he's different than the reasonable man.
Mike, you want to take that first?
Sure. The reasonable police officer is a police officer who's probably been on the job between 5 and 10 years. And he's made a number of different kinds of radio runs. And he's well thought of by his supervisors and maybe even by the community that he serves if he's in a community-based policing situation. So the reasonable police officer is sort of the everyday man that is promulgated for the initial policy, but then that reasonable man is very different in conflict when you go to court. Then that reasonable man is defined by the union and by, you know, attorneys representing the officer or prosecuting the officer. But the reasonable police officer in general is just a guy that works 40 hours, does his job, goes home, and no real conflicts, unless he does something untoward, he gets in trouble. And then there's sort of this new description, like what we saw in Minneapolis, where they try to describe the reasonable person as being, believe it or not, you know, George Chauvin, please. So that's sort of one take on the reasonable police officer view.
Thank you.
And I think real quickly,
Go ahead, Captain.
just real quickly, I think also with the being reasonable and objective was much easier prior to body worn cameras. Because it was very easy to articulate from an officer's perspective alone. That's who you were getting, an officer's perspective of what that incident, how that incident transpired. Now we have video, not just body worn cameras, but every citizen now has video to video or capture that incident, which brings on much different perspectives. So yes, from the officer's vantage point, his actions were reasonable, but from a citizen's or customer standpoint, they view that as unreasonable, and that's where we have the conflict. And just to real quickly piggyback on Chief Cureton, I think also is that reasonable officer over time, as Chief mentioned, 5 to 7, 8 years of police service, the policing culture, the culture of policing has a dramatic impact, I believe, on that officer's behavior over time. Sometimes not to the benefit of the officer, the organization, and ultimately to their customers.
So, Attorney Parks, the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene rather than the 2020 vision of hindsight. That's directly from the Supreme Court cases. Is that a burden for attorneys to overcome?
It is a burden for us to overcome, Chief, in that quite often you're in situations with people who may or may not be doing something lawful. The bigger part of that, though, and this may sound strange, in the few cases we've been in, there's another phenomenon that's come into play. That has been that it's often thought of that the person being arrested has a duty to obey the officer's command. And I can't draw enough emphasis on the fact of how much that has weighed in so many cases that I've been involved in, that the mere fact that the defendant would not obey the officer, that elevated something in the officer to elevate the situation. And in many situations, it ended up being a deadly situation. The problem, though, is, you start weighing these situations, and it's a very factual type situation. Going back to something that Mr. Morrison just said, though, without video, without some recording, it's just the officer's version, right? I was thinking about yesterday morning, I was walking, you good gentlemen, about 6 in the morning in my house, and I saw 4 cop cars pull up in a vacant lot, right? And all I could think about was, oh, they about to have a serious meeting at 6 in the morning as this shift is about to end. And so I can imagine that that's one of those meetings where everybody get together, and I've seen them time and time again. But I got to say to you, in cases that we've been in where we had nothing recorded, it's a tough case. It's a tough case. It's the officer's version. It's his written version. It's what the investigation showed, point blank, period, dot. And I'll make one example, Chief Williams, is the Corey Jones case down in Palm Beach Gardens that we had. And the police officer gave his version. He said, I identified myself as the police. And that's why when he did obey my command, I shot and killed him. Well, thank God there was one little recording out there that he didn't quite figure into the picture that showed that he did not identify himself as the police. And just that one simple fact got him convicted. That one simple fact. So it's a tough job for us because so often, I can't tell you how many cases I've been in where people lost their lives and I had to tell them there was nothing I could do for them because I've had my butt whipped enough times, been in enough battles, wasted enough money in my career and my own personal money that it went nowhere because I had nothing, no ammo, for lack of a better word, to really battle with and learn some hardcore lessons about presentation of cases and what you really need to win.
I have something as we move into our next area, but before we leave this one, you mentioned qualified immunity, Attorney Parks, and I was doing some reading, and in my reading, it said that in America, the law enforcement industry paid over $29 billion in claims involving police misconduct on last year. For example, Chicago paid 85 million. New York City paid over 175 million in claims. LA paid 57 million. You know, as such, do you really think that we need to be focusing so much attention on abolishing or adjusting qualified immunity? It seems like we're doing okay.
Hey, Clarence, you know, I do Fox News sometimes. If I didn't know any better, you sound like a Fox commentator with that particular question, right? And the comeback would be this. Yeah, they spent 29 billion on claims. What was the total budget of all of those 20,000 law enforcement agencies? I'm sure it's in the high trillions if you put all the budgets together. So the number is really small. You and I both know down in the Southeast where we live, they hardly pay any real money to people when they take their lives, even when they're paralyzed. So you know that. So we know the reality is totally different. To use those numbers there in those such large, big numbers does not nearly tell the picture or put the situation in perspective. There's nothing. And you know, I thought you were going to ask me the question also about just how we compare these recent cases, Corey Jones, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor, the criminal versus the civil. I'll say it like this. The amounts of money to settlements really does have a direct correlation to the city, its leadership, and the governing body, the government body there. The attitude that those people take about how they want to handle and deal with bad things that happen in their department depends on that community. There are some communities who still choose to fight. I've been in situations, I'll call a city out, Lakeland, Florida, where the police union almost double dared the city to talk settlement of any type, even when the jury had said that they were responsible. The police union wielded that type of power. So some cities bend to that, some cities don't. And so there's a great number of dynamics that goes into the attitude that cities take in how they pay out cases or not pay out cases. I'll say this here, a lot of it has to do with who the leader of that city is, the mayor, who that mayor is, because that mayor can set a tone. I've been in a situation where I've had a friend who was leading a governmental entity as a city or a mayor. And even if that person wanted to be in my favor, because they knew me or believed in my case, they would have to come to me and say, no, I can't do it. There's so much pressure from me from the police union and the department that I can't even do the right thing when I know it's the right thing. So that's the level of influence, depending on the city, depending on the place where you are. We all know that there are plenty of deaths of people in law enforcement custody where nothing happens, zero happens. And it's not always just police brutality. You know, we deal with medical situations. We deal with, women being raped in prisons. I mean, we had a situation in our state, not to get off topic, but women were being raped in prisons, and I called the FBI and they did not respond. You call the governor, he doesn't respond. So people care about what they want to care about. What I hope and pray is that we have law enforcement people realize that when you take that oath and you have that authority comes with great duty. And we all count on our law enforcement agents to be there for us and to be there in that moment when truth speaks to power.
Thank you so very much, Counselor. I want to venture into the area now, another leg on the stool, police accountability measures. Much has been said about the 21st Century in Policing initiative presented under the Obama administration, and most recently the George Floyd Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act. Those two major pieces of police reform. Captain Muhammad, will you share with us what are some of the opportunities to enhance these two major pieces that have been advanced of police reform initiatives? Before you start, I'm of the opinion they don't quite go far enough, and that we need to do more, and we're over concentrating in certain areas and not looking comprehensively at police reform. What are your thoughts on those two pieces of police reform that are out there? What would you do to enhance them? And if you want to start with an area like in police community relations, for example, under the 21st Century in Policing, it says building trust, community policing and crime reduction, training and education, officer safety and wellness. And I'm just simply reading the pillars from that particular act, but yet that was advanced as major police reform. What would you add to those things?
Well, let me say this foremost, Chief. If former President Obama's police reform had any meat or teeth in it, we wouldn't be talking about doing another. So it's very clear that that reform bill didn't work. Even though the president had the greatest of intentions, we all knew that he gathered a task force to look into and give him suggestions and expertise on what he should put in his police reform bill. I want to say this coming from the community side, that law enforcement have always, in my opinion, never understood their particular role as relate to the community. My friend Captain Rick Morrison and I have been coining the phrase police and customer relationship. Why that is important is because, as our great attorney Parks was talking about the civil suits, you gave us the figure, Chief, of how many billions of dollars it costs.
29.
But those billions of,
29 last year,
billion, those figures was paid by the taxpayers. It never came out of no police budget. When you sue the police department and there's a claim, the city settles the claim. And the money that is paid comes out of the taxpayer's pocket. The taxpayer is what we call the customer and the client. When I look at a police officer, Chief, I look at his uniform and I say, as a customer, wow, I bought that uniform. When I see all the things he have around his gun belt, I say, as a customer, as a taxpayer, I bought that. When I talk about the training and the millions of dollars we invest in police training that they don't use, I say as a customer, wow, we paid for that training. So I think law enforcement need to understand who they serve. When it comes to the Black community, the brown community, they, for some reason, they don't see us as taxpayers. It becomes a them versus us. Now, how do we talk about this reform? Well, I was talking to my great friend, Captain Morrison, and he was talking, and I said, well, you know, Captain Morrison, he's the man who says we need to change the culture of policing. I said, well, you know, you're on that side of the fence. I said, but let me be honest and let's peel back the onion. Dr. Umar Johnson gave this famous quote, Chief: crime and violence is a direct result of unmet social needs. I'm going to say that again. Crime and violence is a direct result of unmet social needs. If that is the truth, and I know it to be the truth, then we don't pay law enforcement to be social workers. It's not the police job to give jobs. It's not the police job to tell the kids, you know, we're going to give you GED. They are an enforcement agency. Matter of fact, they turn into a responsive agency. When you come into the Black community, particularly the Black and brown community, we have to be honest. We lack social needs. The sad part about the police officers that are assigned to our community, Chief, if you stay in our community, you police in our community for any period of time, you will become desensitized. What do I mean? You'll become numb by all of the senseless violence that you see. You can't be a police officer in our community and you see a 14-year-old, a 16-year-old get stabbed, their 13-year-old gets killed, a 9-year-old baby gets shot by a stray bullet, a grandmother serving dinner gets killed. You can't see a young kid get killed because he took his sneakers or his gazelle glasses, and it don't affect you. But over a period of time, it takes away the humanity. So now the community turns into a jungle. So it becomes predator and prey. When we looked at Darren and he had his knee on my brother's neck, that looked like a predator who just caught a prey. Now, sad as crazy as that scenario we may give to the Black community, that's how we see it. So my understanding, Chief, how do we change that? First, we have to give law enforcement a proper understanding of their job. This is what Obama said. In his initiative, there's 3 things that's very important, and I have to say this and I'm gonna be through with it. Police have to be safe. Police training have to be effective, and it has to be lawful. Now, we see law enforcement, and Rick would probably elaborate, or Chief Mike would elaborate. When you talk about police reform, police officers on the other side of the fence thinking in their minds that you've taken away all of their armor. You're taking away their protection because now you asking me to be kind. You asking me to go in the jungle and smile. You asking me to be kind to a community that has social problems. I think that's unfair if we don't give the police officer a great understanding that we have to change the culture on that side of the fence. That's what I do. That's what I'm doing. Yes, we have to teach our young people to respect authority. And let me say this to the attorney, no human being wants their authority challenged. And when you challenge someone's authority, you put them in a position to use some degree of force, whether it's verbal force, physical force, or written force. If my mama told me to watch your young brothers, you in charge, and when she leave and my dad leave, I'm in charge, and she said, make sure your little brother is in the bed at 8 o'clock, And then I said, okay, y'all, it's 8 o'clock. You know, mama said, y'all got to get in the back. You ain't our daddy. You ain't our mama. And they ain't gonna listen to me. So you know what they do? Oh, okay. Oh, you ain't going to bed? Pop, 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 pop. Some degree of force. So it's unfair in one sense that the police use that as an excuse of shooting someone, tasing someone because they didn't respect the authority. And at the same time, it's unfair for our people to think that you got the right to challenge authority. So how do we meet the middle? And I think we're going to get into that as we go down the road. I'm sorry for taking so long, Chief.
No, you set the table. Thank you so very much for the discussion. I mean, these are the two major pieces of police reform that we're drawing a line in the sand about, and that we're willing to go to war over. My question to you: do they go far enough? Are they comprehensive enough? Do they address all the areas that are impacting police use of force? So it does us no good to have body cameras everywhere, and the body cameras simply capture us being killed. When the laws that support police officers and the standards from the federal level down give them unfeathered kinds of protections, creating these standards that are almost insurmountable to overcome. That reminds me of a case that occurred in Cincinnati, Ohio. Samuel DuBose was shot and killed during a traffic stop by University of Cincinnati police officers from the campus police. And the police were not on campus. They were off campus at the time that they made the stop. And Chief Cureton was there in the aftermath of that and participated in the settlement. No, you were not? Okay. Oh, I thought you participated in the settlement.
I worked with the attorneys who sued. I was gone.
Okay.
Then I had advocated when I was a chief that they should be closer to campus, not further away from campus. And what took them off campus was this belief that that's how they needed to patrol the Black folks that were around the almost white campus. And it was wrong.
So in that
was wrong.
In that case, there was body camera footage from 3 police officers. And there was a trial. There were 2 trials, both ended in mistrials, Attorney Parks. And the body camera footage was compelling, but yet a jury could not come to the conclusion that the officer was not acting reasonably under the circumstances. So
Chief, if I may,
go ahead.
On that, Chief.
Go ahead.
You and I were on a call in the last 2 weeks with the governor of Minnesota. And I noticed something very interesting with the level of resources that the state of Minnesota put into the prosecution of the case involving the death of George Floyd. I compare that to a few cases that I was involved in the state of Florida, where I had a chance to be in the room with the governor, see who he appointed to the case, and to get a little decent feel for the level of resources that they put around the case to properly investigate the cases. And I can tell you, and Rick, I realize that you spent a little time in Florida at some point too, so you're a Florida boy to some degree. It's embarrassing, and I wouldn't even want to say publicly what the level of resources that I saw in my state when we were trying to get the state to, 1, investigate a very high profile case, 2, to appoint a special prosecutor, and in 2 of the cases they did, and the level of resources that they gave those prosecutors, and that they didn't see it the way Minnesota saw the George Floyd case, meaning that let's go ahead and be exhaustive in the resources we give a state attorney's office that's been specially appointed. Let's go above and beyond with the level of FDLE resources that we dispatch to support the effort. Let's go all out. If any of you had a chance to see some of the coverage of the aftermath of the trial of George Floyd, you saw they must have had 10 lawyers in the room and another classroom of investigators. I mean, the level that they went to dot every I and cross every T and to exploit resources was amazing. And then they did one step even better than that. They went out and handpicked the top lawyers they thought that they could do to win that case. They didn't just go with the state's resources. That's a whole nother issue. And so you can't say enough about when a leader of a state, county, city makes the decision to pick the right person, but also that we're going to spend millions in resources we need to. We're going to make this the highest priority, push everything else to the side, and handle this. And again, you know, people don't think much about it. Maybe, you know, a few of us have been in various communities and moved about the country, right? When you do that, you get a better feel for what resources are available and what can be allocated, and when people are willing to do it. And I say that seriously because it's a game changer, right? When you listen to Jerry Blackwell talk about the Chauvin case, and he talk about how far they went, put that case together, it's pretty amazing. And that there was only thing that could happen is the man could be convicted. I mean, my God, they put everything in the world against him.
Let me add that a skilled investigator is very important. And it's important that you have skilled investigators on these tough cases. And when that leader doesn't want a good outcome, they will pick a person that isn't the sharpest knife in the drawer to do the investigation. They do those kinds of things. They know who's able to do a proper investigation. One of the unique aspects of the Chauvin case was that the supervisors came in to testify in court. And that's one of the things I advocate, is that when we have these shootings or the death, the immediate supervisor and the second level supervisor, particularly in larger agencies, the sergeants and the lieutenant, should be held to account for the behavior of their officer. Much like having a single car auto accident. You ran into a pole or you ran off the road, most people are still held accountable unless you're Tiger Woods. So my point is, when officers go to roll call, and particularly on an RFE, and it's ice on the road and snow, the supervisor tells you, make sure you don't wreck your car or else you'll be walking the rest of the winter. The number of auto accidents during bad weather is next to zero because they've been told, they've been put on notice. I'm suggesting that same notice can be given about behavior when it comes to use of deadly force, use of force, that the supervisor at that roll call that police officers go to every day. Academy is 6 months, then you're out, then you once or twice a year. Roll call is every day. If I was a young attorney looking at investigating these kinds of incidents, I would look at roll call. Who was at the roll call of that officer? Who was the supervisor? And what kind of instruction did he give? And if there's a failure there, I would expect that the elected officials should have a process that puts that supervisor on notice. They could lose their certification or be demoted, because certainly we don't need supervisors out there who cannot supervise. And so when I think about 40 years ago, when I started as a supervisor, the supervisors protected the police officers. They wrote narratives about what an officer did to protect them. That began to change, and that was taken over by the union. So the union became the protector, where you have situations now where a police officer in a critical incident will call the union before he calls a supervisor. And then once the supervisor gets there, what he finds out in that first 5 or 10 minutes generally doesn't change much. And so it's right up the tree what's going on. And so if those supervisors know they're going to be held accountable for that officer's behavior, I think you can begin to change the culture of an agency almost overnight with a process that holds those middle managers accountable. And right now what we have is the police officer gets protection from the union, and the police chief has probably a pretty good golden parachute contract. But the folks in the middle who drive the culture of an agency, those people in the middle drive the culture. They're watching on TV like everybody else going, oh man, look at what's going on. They don't have any skin in the game. I'm advocating that needs to change. That process needs to change. And we saw some of that with the Chauvin case, where the supervisor, who is now retired though, testified, and the number one person on their seniority, he testified. So they don't have anything sort of at risk in terms of losing their pretty hefty pensions. So this issue of the police officer and the citizen, I use the word compliance. Some of you all might use the word obey. That's a real problem for how we have to stop these killings. I think the 21st century initiative was a case of community policing on steroids. How anybody can put community policing in operation, plus some pretty good stuff about data collection and what data collection can do and who analyzes that data. I thought that was a real good, at the time, first steps in at least getting people an idea of what community policing can do and how to implement it. The George Floyd Act, though, has teeth in it on accountability, because it begins to really force police officers, managers, but police officers to look at what they're doing, because now everything's at risk. So I see the two sort of have different roles, but one building off the other. And so I would hope that the George Floyd Act passed will add some accountability to how people operate police departments in 2021 and beyond. The idea of policing people has to change. We have to have reimagine a different way of doing that service. It's very, very complex. The whole mental health piece, I got involved in that to a certain extent with the mental health community. And what I discovered was the mental health community believes law enforcement is too loose with the definition of who has mental illness. That they police think everybody's crazy. Well, everybody's not crazy. And the word that kept coming up was coping skills. That in the mental health community, people have coping skill issues, but they don't have mental health issues. But the police want to make them all have mental health issues. And there's a big conflict there. And how do you address a person that has coping skill problems, but he's not mentally ill? And conversely, how do you, as a police officer, deal with the compliance issue? Because of all of this attention, compliance ain't what it used to be, because there is no fear, and there is a TV camera or a cell phone watching everything you do. It makes it very, very, very difficult. But centrally, I think the culture has to change, and the place that has to change is two spots. One is that roll call every day, and two is the accountability for those supervisors between police officers and police chiefs.
Captain Morrison, talking about accountability and taking into consideration those things that Chief Cureton is talking about, there's much talk about citizen complaint authorities and police commissions. Is there a need for mechanisms that provide civilian oversight of law enforcement?
I think the short answer is yes, there is a great need for civilian oversight, but is it sustainable? And my pushback would be, presently, no. Civilian oversight is needed, but is it sustainable? And my response would be no, and here's why. under the current national narrative on policing, it would be difficult to get an honest buy-in from many police organizations. We often talk about community having the trust in its police, but we have to consider how much does the police trust its community? How does the police profession, when viewed as a racist institution that needs to be defunded or abolished, welcome and embrace a civilian complaint board, especially with investigative powers? This only creates, or potentially creates, a deepening mistrust and could hinder police cooperation with future investigations. So I think in order to combat that strategy, because again, I think it's very important that we do have civilian oversight, is one way to overcome that is to involve the police in the discussion of a civilian oversight board and involve them in the selection process, to put safeguards in, to make sure it's fair, it's transparent, it doesn't come political, and its members are reflective of the entire community. I think also to get a better buy-in from law enforcement with oversight boards, each member must complete a background and vetting process, training, to understand what the police culture is, to understand policies, procedures, law, investigative techniques, and best practices. They should assign a law enforcement liaison to help the board navigate through the organizational culture, and to put term limits on those memberships. I think the second thing that we do in law enforcement a very poor job on is a lot of times when we develop a new initiative, a new policy, a new strategy, we do not educate and inform the rank and file. They come in one day and all of a sudden now you've got an oversight board. They don't know why, they don't know who, they don't know what's the purpose. And so one of the ways to make this more effective as an introductory to police organizations is you have to front load your personnel first. Here's the reason why we are going to a civilian oversight board. Here's their role, their scope, their power. This is what it is, and this is what it's not. Now, it may not make the pill taste easier, but it does make the pill a little easier to swallow when you're informed. And here's my final takeaway for this, because again, I think there is a great need for civilian oversight. It brings more trust and transparency back to the customer, but we must continue to remind law enforcement. And here's the takeaway. Policing was designed to serve its customers and not control them.
Thank you, Captain. All right, the gentlemen, we've been at it for about an hour. I wanted to save some time for questions, but I really wanted to get into the third leg, and that's some training aspects. So we'll take the next 15 minutes remaining to do that, and then save the last 15. Maybe we'll have a question or two. Starting off this training notion, I've heard, and it's been described, that the color of a police officer or gender of a police officer working in a particular neighborhood makes a difference. Captain Muhammad, it is perceived that white male officers are aggressive and exemplify aggressive behavior in communities of color, and that it seems that Black and female officers are less aggressive in those same communities. What is the difference in how Black and white police officers provide service from your perspective?
Well, Chief, that's a good question. it is very clear that over my many years of training and giving training to law enforcement, the sad part about me going into departments and giving them training is never on a proactive tip. It's always because some incident have took place that the city and the police chief are under pressure from the community to give these officers some sense of training. The worst thing of any trainer or facilitator, and every one of us know this, is to train any police department under reactive conditions, responsive conditions. They are more likely to resent and resist the training than to accept it because they believe it ain't nothing but a bunch of BS and it's political. One of the most important things why there's a difference between how African Americans deal with their own and how whites deal with African Americans is definitely the perception that is in the minds of the white officer. When the white officer approaches the black person, he have a fear attitude. It may not be so much fear because he's black, but he also knows that he's going into stopping someone who he perceives, ain't got nothing to do whether it's real or not, may be armed, may be confrontational, may be a drug dealer, may be, all these maybes. So when he approached people of color, he's approaching them from a training that teaches them you must get the bad guy off the street. That's all they go through in that training. Bad guy, bad guy, bad guy. Well, if we ask them, Chief, what do the bad guy look like? Because we're not talking about the good guys wear white, the bad guys wear black. What does the bad guy look like? If you ask most of these young up and coming rookies that's coming out the academy, they perceived the bad guy as being the black guy. Now, they would never say that. That's debatable. People will argue, oh man, Captain, you racist, blah, 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 blah. But how come that when the black police officer pulls over a black person, he don't have that fear? His whole attitude of approach is completely different. You would never take another person of color, you would never take a black person and send them to police Chinatown. It don't make sense because I don't speak Mandarin. Why would you send me into a community where I don't know the culture? We're talking about culture-based policing, then culture-based policing must be every people, every race should have the right to have their own police officers that look like them. It just makes sense. But when you have a disproportionate number of whites outnumber the number of black officers, so that's where we get the white officer in the black community. How do we change that, Chief? Number one, if we're going to deal with the reality of changing, we must be able to do more recruitment of black police officers so that we can have a larger number of proportionate officers that can go into the black community. I prefer an all black police officer community, and I would love to see white police officers holler for cultural diversity. They ain't hollering for cultural diversity, we are. I love to see why. Well, we need to change the culture. We need to get in there. There's too many black folks. Well, the bottom line is this: the black community is tired. The black community don't trust white police officers no more, good or bad. That's reality. Now the question is, have we come to a juncture in the road where we must begin to talk about, hey, we got to change the color scheme now? I think it's unfair to the white officers to put them into a community where they don't know the real culture of and the dynamics and the social, listen, key word, social problem. When Chief Carrick talked about mental health, and coping skills. I thought he was talking about police officers, because it's easy to say that the community got mental health, and do the community have coping skills? And the community can say just as easily, do that police officer got coping skills? How do we know that he's not mentally messed up? So if we're going to change to give them a training, the training must be based upon respect. I'm on this side of the fence. And on this side of the fence, Chief, I'm doing all in my power as a peacekeeper, as a man who loves to get our community to begin to look like everybody else's community. I want to get rid of the drug dealer in the community. I want to get rid of all the strip clubs in the community. I want to make the Black community a community that make it difficult for anyone to come into our community, whether it's Black police officer or white police officer, and abuse that community because the community is abusing itself. That's my job. The police part, that's complicated. I hope that the police and the law enforcement deal with y'all's problem. That's not my problem. My problem is changing the sick culture, the destructive behavior on my side of the fence, where we're killing one another at an alarming rate. That's my job. How do we get Black people, Black youth, to respect themselves? How do we get Black youth to see their value and not see themselves as not being able to live past 20? How do we change that? Well, that ain't the police job. That's our job as men, Black men in the community. So that's my piece that I'm lending. I talked to Rick. You can't listen to me. You can't talk about police and community relationship, and you invest all this money, brothers, into law enforcement training, but you don't invest no training into the community. What sense does it make that you invest training in the police department, but you don't invest no training to give young people, our people, a training that would help them to respect the police department? So I think if we're going to be honest, it has to be based upon mutual respect. Yes, the police need training. Yeah, and I say the community need training. When both get training, then we could talk together, not from an emotional pain, but from a realistic understanding each other culture.
Thank you so very much, Captain. We're getting close to the time when I want to open up the discussion for questions. I see there are a few that are being gathered here, and we're asking our producer to assemble those for us. But I want to kind of do a rapid fire here. 15 seconds. Residency as a requirement for service employment for law enforcement officers. Attorney Parks, where are you? Residency.
I don't think they have to live in the city where they police. It's better if they do, but I don't think it should be a steadfast requirement.
Chief Cureton?
Yes, they should live in a city that they're policing.
Captain Morrison?
I think it would be very conducive to live in the city where you police, but the police culture has to change.
Captain Mohammed?
I think it'd be a great requirement. I think it's a great requirement.
Captain Mohammed, union oversight. Possible?
Well, that's a tough one, and I think those in the law enforcement community have to deal with it. I think that is the elephant in the room, and I tip my hat off anyone who's trying to deal with the union. It's a tough one, but it has to be possible. It has to be possible.
Chief Cureton, union oversight.
I don't know what the level of oversight is. I mean, there is some level. It depends on the leader of the union, how political they are. That has to be addressed. But for the union, I've probably been fired or in jail now, but because of some union protection. So there needs to be some oversight. Not sure to what extent it should be, though.
Captain Morrison, union oversight.
I think there should be some union oversight, and I think also taking the politics out of unions.
Attorney Parks? Police unions, too much power?
Way too much power. Too much power. In fact, in the case we talked about Corey Jones, you know, the officer gave a walkthrough that's very controversial in police circles. And I understand the union has been fighting to make that not part of the lay of the land going forward.
It is no longer the lay of the land. You will never see another walkthrough in Palm Beach County.
But Chief, let me say this here though.
The lawsuit that you brought.
I tip my hat to Palm Beach County though, because that level of transparency should be the standard. That an officer should be willing to tell their side of the story right then before they get lawyered up and coached up, and tell the truth as he or she sees it. If it doesn't go in his favor, well, so be it, but tell the truth. And so we quickly see that when we should be about truthfulness, it's not about truthfulness, right? It's about skillfulness of getting out of something and resources. And that's a shame.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you so very much. This has been above and beyond and has met all of my expectations. And I hope that we've been useful and provided some practical approaches to comprehensive law enforcement reform.
Chief, we need to show the CLE code.
We got some time, but thank you so very much. The CLE code 001 code is blue. There it is on your screen, ladies and gentlemen, the CLE code. We thank you so very much for your participation. And as we promised, we got about 12 minutes or so left. Can our producer help us with the questions?
Yes, we have a question here. Are these programs that groom young Black men or young Black people for law enforcement?
Chief Cureton, you want to tackle that? Programs that groom young Black men for law enforcement. You and I are a product of one of those programs, aren't we?
Yeah, in Cincinnati, they have a cadet program when we started where you started right out of high school. They provided on-the-job training for a couple of weeks at different assignments in the police department. And then you went to college for, back then it was quarters. And so you did that till you were 21. And at 21, you took a test, you became a police officer. Today, they have a similar kind of program here in Cincinnati, and I'm sure it's around the country, where they have sort of like a police explorer or a fire explorer program where they do training for young people between the ages of 17 and 22 or 23. And after they finish that training on various aspects of policing, mainly around evidence collection and evidence processing, auto accident, reconstruction, those kinds of things, the patrol function. And then of course they want you to go to the college and get that started. So those kinds of programs exist in mainly larger cities around the country.
And Attorney Parks, for creative lawyers who are engaged in settlement discussions, certainly that could be part of what they discuss if the family, or of course, if the client is so amenable. And we've seen those kind of creative approaches to recent settlements here in America. So,
but Chief, remember now, that requires that you have a city that's actively involved in the case, not just turn it over to some law firm who they're hiding behind. When city leaders decide to get involved, to be the executive in the room and lead the discussion of how you resolve the matter, then you get to that. But people love to hide behind their insurance provided lawyer and act as if that person is calling the shots when they really aren't the shot caller. When we really need the executive in the room, or someone from the governing body who steps in there and, you know, who really leads the discussion. I'll tell you, Ben and I had a case one time in St. Augustine, Florida. Sheriff Shores is sheriff up there now in St. Johns County, right? And he was the chief of police at St. Augustine at the time. We had a kid who was paralyzed. Chief Shore came to every deposition, right? What that did though is it gave me a rapport with him. I'd sat in a whole bunch of rooms with him many days through many depositions, right? And when the time came for the counsel to go in the private to talk, right? He went in there with them. And I know what kind of person I had advocating for that case in the room, right? He had seen it all, he knew it all. And so you need that level of people and experience and knowledge about the situation to lead to a whole different type of discussion when you have those kind of things.
Thank you. The next question.
What can we achieve through more rigorous training? It seems that police training budgets and requirements are miserably inadequate.
Captain Morrison, you want to take that on?
Yeah, so as a former academy director, I think we have to change the mentality and the mindset of how we conduct police training. I think too often the culture of police training is more of a checkbox mindset. We go through the motions. And I'll give you a great example as a cop way back. I think I was a sergeant when cultural diversity training came out, and it was mandated. The entire department had to go through culture diversity. And so we were forced in the classrooms. We signed the roster. We sat for 8 hours and heard about cultural diversity. And then after 8 hours, we signed the roster, and it was like a herd of cattle getting out that front door. We rushed out the doors to thank God we're done with diversity training. And for most officers, in the first 20 minutes of getting out of class, it was forgotten about what we talked about, what we learned. And I think overall, especially from a training environment in the policing, I think we do a very bad job at measuring the efficacy of training, the follow up and follow through of training, and holding the leaders accountable when the desired outcome is not achieved. You can't treat training as a checkbox. It looks good on the website, it looks good on a brochure, but if it's not meaningful, sustainable, and being held accountable, it's just another training.
Captain, talk briefly about the balance in law enforcement training. I read that law enforcement officers train 80% of the time for the job that they do 20% of the time. They train 20% of the time for what it is that they're engaged in 80% of the time. And the 80% of the training is on how to take them down, how to shoot them, and all of those things. So we do those things well. The 20% of the training is on the soft skill stuff. And as a former police chief, and Chief Cureton can attest to it, all of your customer service complaints, if you will, Captain Mohammed, were on that area where we train the least amount of time. So is there a need to strike a balance in the types of training that law enforcement officers are engaged in?
I would absolutely say yes. And I'm going to admit this, as an academy director for 8 years, way back, I was part of that culture where when you came in as a recruit on day one, the message was, if you're not wearing a badge, they're out to kill you. And it's all about officer survival. No matter what the topic that was taught at the academy, the common thread was officer survival. You will survive and you will go home at the end of your shift at all costs. And there was very little discussion or training on the serve side of the badge. The
Yes.
warrior side, the enforcement side, we have it down solid.
Yes.
So my wish for law enforcement training would be at least equal to, if not more, on the serve side of training. I think the high liability training is very important. You got to learn how to shoot and be confident, how to drive, how to do appropriate defensive tactic measures. Those are still needed and a great foundation. But for most police training today in the culture, it comes at a cost of the serve side of the badge. So I think we need to, in training, either equal or if not more on the customer service side of training.
Thank you for that, Captain. Do we have another question?
No.
Okay. On that training dynamic, Captain Mohammed, you have what's your response? Do you have a perspective on that?
I think Rick did a very good job. Captain Rick did a very good job. There's no question that people skills, they put very little emphasis on people skills training. I like the, when you hear the word and it's almost just a slogan. It's so easy to say police and community. The reason why we're taking the word community out of it, Chief, is because what part of the community you talking about serving? The Black community is very diverse. When you say we want to police the community relationship, what are you talking? Police and the preacher's religious relationship, police and the politician relationship, because you're only going to get 30, if not 25% of the people who would cooperate with police in any relationship. What about the other 75? What about the other 80%? They're not buying into it. So how do you get the 80% who want to buy into a relationship? First, you can't use the word community because it's too diverse. So if you use the word customer, wow, that's everybody. Yeah, I'm sorry. Even Pookie, who's selling dope, his mama's paying taxes, she's a customer. So when you put everybody in a customer relationship, now what Rick saying, I like what Captain Rick saying, what should be given to training is a balance by giving law enforcement customer service training. I think that is so important. And police and law enforcement can't see that as being a do-gooder and being kind, and kindness will get me killed. Get that crazy, sick mentality. It is a known fact that you don't see no Blacks killing no police officers. Maybe once in a blue moon, but everybody want to be treated with respect. I don't want no police officer to approach me because he's afraid. No, that's not fair. I want him to approach me with the same level of respect he do the Jewish community, the Irish community, the Italian community, the Asian community. I want the same kind of respect. And you know what? We're working on my side of the fence to teach our people to put ourselves in a position to gain that kind of respect.
Thank you. Let's see, I think we have time for one more question here. Psychological testing was a requirement in the past for some departments. Should it be re-implemented? I'm not aware of any departments that don't have some aspect of that but my involvement has only been with major police departments. There are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in America, and I don't think that includes the federal agencies. So for our police officers, psychological testing should be a requirement, and ongoing evaluation of the employee, especially the law enforcement employee, from a psychological standpoint is important. And why do you say that? I said, well, look, we have a maintenance schedule for our automobiles. We have a maintenance schedule for the cleaning of our guns. We have a maintenance schedule for the cleaning of our computers. We have a maintenance schedule for all of that stuff that supports us, but we don't have a maintenance schedule for the most valuable human resource that we employ, and that's the human being. And we ask them to place themselves in these difficult situations day in and day out. So I'm a big proponent of a maintenance schedule. We need to be in a position to take police officers off the battlefield for a while. Back in our day, Chief Cureton, everybody wanted to be in a preferred assignment because it got you weekends off and a normal kind of work schedule. But those were only few and far between jobs. So we need to do a better job to the questioner in safeguarding and protecting, the human resource. We don't do a good job there.
Yeah, when I was, before I left Cincinnati Police, we were looking at a psychological evaluation to occur in the 15th year or thereabouts to do a reassessment. How has this person changed from day one to 15 years later, looking at their experiences? And we didn't get too far, but we were collecting data that showed there were certain officers that had too many critical incidents, that maybe we ought to have a process to offload people at the 15-year mark so that they don't get any worse and they don't increase liability for the city. On the same token, when I was at the University of Cincinnati, because they had such lax sort of hiring practices, I had contracted with a psychologist to come up with an instrument on the beginning to see, am I hiring a Mother Teresa or am I hiring Rambo or somebody in between? And it was a pretty good instrument. As a matter of fact, he told me that the officer that killed Dubose, he had recommended that they not hire him, but that he was too aggressive. And so these tools do work. And so I believe whether you use them on the front end or somewhere during the career, it's important because the job, from my perspective, does change people who were good people day one. They went to their first roll call and they were told, forget everything they told you at the academy. Your education starts here at roll call. That process begins to change everything.
Thank you.
Hey, Chief, guys, one real quick concern I have that's not often talked about.
Sure.
And I think most politicians or anybody else, especially in law enforcement, don't want to say this. But law enforcement, we rely so much on military folks coming out of the military, and military folks gravitate towards law enforcement because we're a paramilitary organization. And I think that's, I've spent, like I said, hired many military folks and great cops. Really great. But we have to have a consideration because just like with cops coming out of the war zone, we have a lot of returning veterans who served honorably, came from a war zone, and that we're going to hire them back into another war zone. So I think we have to have an honest conversation at some point, and I know it's not popular because, especially from a politician standpoint, it seems like you're dogging the military, which I'm not, but it's a consideration. It's not fair to the applicant potentially. It's not fair to the organization, and ultimately it's not fair to the customer. If folks coming back from the battlefield who even served honorably, put them back into almost the same environment. So we got to be careful with that and have a deeper conversation.
But the producer tells me that we got time for one last question. And that question, what should be done to prevent white supremacists from becoming officers?
Let me just, I think that it's hard to identify by just a look and by just a color a white supremacist. But I do think that those who are practicing white supremacy have a trail or track record. Before you hire, I think they should do the same thing that FBI do when there's a mass shooting. The first thing they do is go to their social media page, because the social media page is a blueprint of the conversations, the mindset, whether it's Instagram, whether it's Facebook. And I think when you go to hire or to vet any police officer, go to his social page and see the kind of groups he belongs to, see the kind of conversation he's involved with. And the greatest way to identify is go to the neighborhood and do an interview with his old classmate, his doctor that delivered it, and his preacher, and they're going to give you an honest view of that person's mentality. That's what I think.
Well,
One quick,
go ahead,
Mike.
You make me feel old because in the times when I was responsible that we didn't have social media. It's a new phenomenon. And yeah, you can tell an awful lot about a person from that social media piece. But in addition to that, I think we still have to use our psychological tools. Those people tend to leave a footprint, if you will, on their activities. somebody knows and somebody said something. You know, when Chief Williams and I was in Cincinnati, you remember the captain that he would go in his office and read war books, but he's really reading Nazi books. And when you start looking at him, you say, wow, he kind of looks like a daggone Nazi. So there are tools that administrators can use that people are going to talk and people are going to gossip, and they have tools to find out, is this person involved in that kind of behavior, and then dismiss them. So there are a couple different things that can happen before. Social media nowadays makes it, you know, a little easier than it was back in my day, where you really did have to knock on doors and talk to different people if they would talk to the police about something as intimate as somebody being a white supremacist. You'd be talking to another white supremacist, asking them if that guy's a white supremacist. And they both looking at you like, no, we're not that. Probably you. So it is difficult. It is difficult, but it needs to be dealt with.
I real quickly, as I close it out, I think one of the easiest ways to identify white supremacy in the police culture is break down that blue wall of silence. And it does exist. It might not be very popular after the Zoom, but it's easier to turn the other way than to address it. And that's why I said all the cops aren't bad, but there's a few bad apples that need to go, as well as that blue wall of silence. Got to go too.
Gentlemen, I just want to thank you so very much for this lively discussion, and I hope and trust that it's been of benefit to practitioners who are out there in the field, and that they're able to use some of the things that we've talked about and discussed to further their practice. You know, as lawyers put on their social engineering cap and try to make things better in our community. So thank you so very much, each one of you, for taking this time to serve with me on this panel, to be of benefit to the National Bar Association on this international summit. I don't think we have time for much more. I want to turn to my co-chair, Attorney Daryl Parks, to close us out, and we can put up the CLE credits one more time. Information, Mr. Producer, if we can. And I want to thank everybody from the National Bar Association and that helped us and in being successful. Ms. L. Michelle Hall, thank you so very much for returning the late night calls. We appreciate it. Attorney Parks.
Thank you very much, Chief. Everyone, since I am a past president of the National Bar, I want to thank all of you on behalf of the NBA for being here, for advancing the ball. I think these type of dialogues go a long way in keeping the thought processes out there. Honored to have been on this panel with all of you. Wish I was meeting you in person. You all seem to be very interesting people, but maybe that day will come in the future. God bless you all. Stay safe. Like the rest of America, go have a great summer. I pray you have gas in your tank. And Mike Cureton, I'm wondering, are you really sitting somewhere in the Caribbean, or is that just a background?
Thank you so very much, everyone.
Thank you.
My grandkids is being around me, and I got to keep them under control.
Good stuff. Good stuff. God bless everyone. Thank you.
All right, you are too. Thank you. Thank you.
Chief,